Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. How dangerous is your food, your water, the air you breathe? Are Americans being poisoned by industrial pollution and pesticides, or are these threats vastly exaggerated? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Jessica Matthews, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Lester Lave, Professor of Economics at Carnegie Mellon University, Frederica Perera, Professor of Public Health at Columbia University, and Fred Smith, President of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. The topic before this House, environmental risks. What's real? What's not? This week on Think Tank. The late political scientist Aaron Wildavsky wrote 15 years ago, and I quote, "How extraordinary the richest, longest-lived, best protected, most resourceful civilization with the highest degree of insight into its own technology is on its way to becoming the most frightened." And since then, it seems Americans have only become more scared. Epidemic disease used to kill Americans by the thousands. Today, polio, tuberculosis, and typhoid are almost unknown thanks to vaccinations and better sanitation. Accident rates have also plummeted. Advances in technology and ever stricter safety regulations have reduced accidents that occur on the road, at work, and at home. As a result, U.S. life expectancy at birth has soared, more than doubling from a mere 31 years in 1890 to 75 years today. Yet, public fear is high. According to a recent poll, 78% of Americans believe they are subjected to more risk today than their parents were 20 years ago. People worry about the health hazards posed by pesticides, pollution, and nuclear waste. But what is really dangerous to your health? Well, according to a recent study from the University of Pittsburgh, cigarettes are deadly. Statistically speaking, the average American male smoker would live 6.6 years longer if he gave up smoking. Automobile accidents shorten the life of an average American by 200 days, and bicycle accidents by 27 days. Meanwhile, some of the environmental risks that people fear most are relatively minor. Food treated with pesticides cuts life expectancy by all of 12 days. Hazardous waste, only 2.5 days, and nuclear power shortens the average American's life by less than 1 hour. But various public health experts and environmentalists say that we don't really know how dangerous some things are. Therefore, they say we should err on the side of caution when trying to control risky activities. They also argue that Americans should not be exposed involuntarily to any risks from pesticides or hazardous wastes. Fred Smith, let me begin with you. Should Americans be scared of their environment?
They should be scared of the risk posed by environmental policy. What we've done is created fear-mongering agencies and laws that encourage people to frighten us, and it's been very effective. The safest, wealthiest society in the world, as the chart showed earlier, is frightened to death.
Jessica?
I don't think life expectancy is the right measure at all. There are plenty of risks, and the question is really, what benefit do you get for a small marginal risk? That's one thing people weigh. The other thing people weigh is that they feel totally differently about risks they control versus risks they don't, and that's really what, to my mind, is the crucial distinction.
Lester?
I think that we've gotten richer. We're a lot richer than our grandparents in the 1890s. At that point, you could see what it was that was going to kill you. Now we can't see it or smell it, and so I think we're richer. We're more concerned about these things. We've knocked out most of the causes of what we can worry about, and so we're more concerned about the things that we can't see that might kill us.
Frederica?
Well, I think Americans are concerned. I'm not sure about this premise that they're terrified. I think they're concerned, and rightfully so, about environmental risks. There are such risks. We've identified some of them, and we've dealt with them, and regulations have been effective in controlling those risks and in lowering cancer rates in workers and male sterility and neurologic disease in children. So we have seen in our recent history the impact of regulation of risks, and new risks are emerging. It's very important as we present those to the public that we're very, very clear. We owe them that, to be very clear about the basis of risk assessment.
Has there been, on the part of the environmentalists, a regular staccato exaggeration of these threats?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think there are different takes on the magnitude of risks for one particular pollutant. There's a lot of uncertainty in the risk estimates. But I think what's really important is to present to the public the range of estimates and the uncertainty, what government can do and what they themselves can do if there are steps that they can take.
The problem is, of course, we're not getting a balanced assessment of risk. EPA tells us very little bit about the need for a better diets, to eat more fruits, fresh fruits and vegetables. They terrify us about the possibility of small trace residuals.
The Department of Agriculture tells us a ton
about
but
what we're
fruits
ending
and
up there, though,
so
the agencies that are challenging us on risk issues are not focusing on better diets are one of the best ways we can reduce cancer rates. And instead, we're trivializing the risk by running around and talking about organic good, natural bad. What is it, 1/10,000th of the cancer-causing substances we find in our diets are related to man-made. 99.99 are coming about because of natural ingredients that our bodies are prepared partially to address.
Well,
Shouldn't we worry about serious risk first?
I question those statistics.
That's
in fact,
Bruce Ames's data,
yes.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, and we've had a debate back and forth, and others have as well, and I question those numbers. They're really based on inadequate data on the numbers of carcinogens, their potency, so they're very much
But there are
guesstimates.
carcinogens in natural foods.
Yes, there are indeed, and I think we should be concerned about carcinogens like aflatoxin, which is now regulated actually and removed. That's a natural, semi-natural carcinogen.
Sulfuric acid?
But the problem is that with the pesticides, I think the latest figures were that 10% of pesticides and inert ingredients had actually been tested for toxicity. So we don't know a lot about what these pesticides can do.
But we also don't know very much about what natural ingredients. You're talking
That's
about,
right.
We're spending much
Yes.
more of our effort testing man-made ingredients as though man was trying to do us in, whereas nature's been around a lot longer and it's caused much more of our risk.
Let me ask you a question. I've been reading through some of this material, and you all might respond to it. It seems to me that the dynamic that is going on is that environmentalists raise an alarm about something because of the nature of fundraising and political power and everything else. That, as in any movement, those fears become purposefully exaggerated. Right. Then the other side comes in and says, you environmentalists are exaggerating this, but then they also point out, look at all the good things that have happened, carbon dioxide is down, this is down, this is down.
Carbon dioxide.
Excuse me?
Up. Yes.
Well,
you know
no, all the EPA things.
Sulfur, right. There are some air
all
pollutants that are
the
down.
measurable things that have been controlled in the last 20 years by the Environmental Protection Agency, those lines are
Some
all coming
things-
down, in
right.
part because of environmental activism that brought us to this thing.
Right.
So what you're saying is they're exaggerating, but by the way, their exaggeration has led to a lot of good.
That's actually not what we try to say. What we're arguing is that the first generation haystack problems, as it were, the fact that we had untreated sewage flowing into rivers, and unfortunately still do in some cases, that we had these massive flows of millions of tons of particulates in the air, those kind of problems can sometimes be worked on in the political sector by ham-handed regulations. But we're now going not after haystacks, but needle in the haystack problems, these tiny, tiny parts per billion risk, where those areas, EPA's own assessments, external reviews of EPA asking the wrong question, a Harvard study,
I think
we
there's
basically
something,
are wasting time
there's
in this
something
area.
to say here, but I think there's a nub of truth, and that is, I don't agree that all the current risks are de minimis. But one thing has happened, which is in 20 years, our technology for measuring chemicals or radiation has improved in some cases by a factor of 1,000 or even 10,000. Gas chromatographs, all kinds of things that could measure things in parts per trillion
Needles.
that used to show up as zero, right? But our capacity for managing those risks, for understanding them, for responding appropriately, let's say generously, let's say it's twice as good as it was 20 years ago, and some people might not say that much. So one thing is improved by insensitivity by a factor of 1,000 or 10,000, and the other by a factor of 2, we've got what appears to be a lot more problems.
I think that this polarizing the debate by saying there are risks, there aren't risks, I think we're past that. It's really much more of trying to take a look at what are the priorities. Are we working on the right things? I think the problem is that we're not working on the right things.
But that does get us to the point, Lester, where the institutions we've created, the EPA and the environmental activist organizations, tend to focus on a subset of risks that advance their agendas. And the concept that there are risks that regulation can address and there are risks that regulation creates, the risks that we're overspending and therefore impoverishing ourselves, the wealthier is healthier literature, which suggests that when you take money...
Why don't you explain that, wealthier is healthier?
Well, regulations obviously have economic consequences. It costs money to monitor and to create rules. If those, so there's a wealth effect. We're somewhat poorer when we regulate. We better be buying something for that. If the risk we're addressing by regulation are very small, and the cost of those regulations are large relative to the risk, we may be creating more risk by making us a poorer nation than we're addressing by making us an over-regulated nation. That wealthier is healthier argument, I mean, you're the public health area. One of the best things you can do to improve public health of a nation, in America, but especially in the third world, is to allow these countries the ability to rapidly expand the use of technology and economic growth to make them healthier.
Well, I've been doing research for several years in Eastern Europe. Now, that's not a wealthier environment, but that's an example of where you had development and exploitation of resources without regulation, which is absolutely horrendous.
Wait a minute, well, that's not fair.
I know.
Regulated country in the world.
I'm giving you a sort of an extreme example. I mean, you're implying that our regulations have had no benefit, that they've been useless. In fact, I think we can document very great benefits in terms of health protection to children. There were an estimated 10 million children who were protected by the lead standard, prevented from having nervous system damage during their early years. And there are other such real milestones. Now it's true that we are dealing with less obvious risks, and we have moved from waiting for human data, which we did initially, to basing risk assessments on testing data in the laboratory and using statistical modeling. Now, my whole point is that we must do a solid job of assessing the risks, and then when they are significant, and agencies are not proposing to regulate risks that don't reach and
true. Unfortunately,
exceed quite a threshold.
But it's not really true, Doctor, because in effect, if you look at the way
it's true that the risks have to be significant, and usually that's quite a high threshold.
Alar, asbestos, dioxin, over and over again, PCB.
But no, wait a minute. Alar is a known potent carcinogen.
And
yes, of course they are, but so is
by EPA were that the risks were 1 in 10,000.
No, but we're not talking about. Of course, there are risks of chemicals. I think the problem is there are also risk of over-regulating chemicals.
Sure there are.
When we reduce the use of pesticides or all these other trace elements, undoubtedly there's some health benefits, but there are also health consequences. There are risk and there are risk, and when we say that the only risk we face in a modern society is technology, we're trivializing the situation.
Jessica, would you feed your children apples with ALAR? Would you have a problem with that?
Well, I mean, luckily that doesn't arise since...
Well, it did. In the past, they were sprayed with ALR, and my understanding is that it was all a red herring, or a green herring, depending on the apple you're talking about.
I think I think there are still some uncertainties, although my understanding is, and maybe Ricky can confirm that, the last study that was done, in fact, found, after ALR was removed from the market, found it to be a more potent carcinogen than had previously been known, and at lower doses. There are...
But were they at dosages that could harm human beings? I mean, they do these tests where they pump up a laboratory rat with 10,000 times the amount. It's like saying ALAR is a carcinogen. If you take a bag of it and drop it on a rat, it'll die. But that's not saying that if you give it a tiny.
Well, the question is, if you say to me, "Here's an apple that's been treated with ALAR. Would you like your child to eat it?" I'll say no, because I can have an apple without it. And so the question that I think that then the society asks is, what benefit did ALAR bring? And that's the thing I think often, it's not just the cost of whether you use it or not, but is it a marginal benefit that the apples stay longer on the trees and are easier to harvest, or look prettier?
Lester, could you give us sort of a ranking of what is most dangerous to us, sort of starting from the top and going down? Just let's get some numbers out
If you're
there.
currently a smoker, then smoking is the most dangerous thing you can do. If you don't do up your seatbelts when you're in a car, that's probably the most dangerous thing you can do. I'm sometimes struck by seeing children roaming around in the back of a station wagon with a parent up front who's smoking. Seems to me that's really an irresponsible set of actions. Beyond that, we're certainly talking about diet, for example, of what it is that you're eating.
Alcoholism is a
Diet is going to be more of a problem than alcohol, at least for the average American. As you get on down, we still have some, I think that we're just in danger of trivializing the issue. There certainly are some environmental risks. I think that throwing out the laboratory testing, saying that stuff is invalid, is just not right.
Well, what are they?
What we have to do is we have to start looking at what are the highest priorities. The Environmental Protection Agency did this, right? We don't have to ask what Lester Lave's opinion is. We have both the senior staff of the Environmental Protection Agency and then the academic scientists who were on the Science Advisory Board. They ranked what the risks were. They said that there are some things that are vastly regulated, overstated, like hazardous waste dumps. There are other things like indoor air quality, radon in homes, that are much more of a risk than that. And so they wanted to get the priorities straight. And we've had EPA administrators who have pleaded with Congress to give them the ability to get the priorities straight. And unfortunately, we haven't done that. So let's get away from this debate about whether we're going to drop 10,000-pound bags of Alar on rats and see whether it hurts them. Let's talk about real risks and priorities.
In fact, that really isn't true, that animal testing does not occur that way. That's really quite a distortion of the methodology that's used. And as I mentioned earlier,
they do overdose them. They don't give them normal rates.
Well, a dose is chosen, that is a tolerated dose for that animal, a maximum tolerated dose, and then fractional doses below that, because of the fact that the animal has such a short lifespan compared to humans. And the most recent assessment of that question, are animal tests valid, by the National Academy of Sciences working group on that subject, reaffirmed it as a valid procedure. What's the alternative? To wait for human data. Now, I want to dispel another myth here.
Wasn't there a major dissenting opinion to that in that very report?
There was a dissent. There were, in fact, I think, several dissenting opinions in the report. One saying it's not going far enough strong enough, and one disagreeing. But I'm not certain how many dissenting opinions there were. But the fact is that is an established methodology that we use because we don't want the alternative of waiting for cases of illness and actual deaths. And we want to move forward from this chemical by chemical.
But Ricky, you're missing the point I really think here, that look, we're not arguing that there are not risks associated with the unknown. We're always, in a sense, of walking into a world we don't know that well. The trick is, can we know everything before we act? Is this whole idea that before we open doors we have to be absolutely certain what's behind them? Or are there risks of stagnating our society by frightening ourselves and avoiding the role of technology? We are arguing, are there risks of pesticides? And I think we all are aware there must be some risk, high or low, but fairly small, in the area of pesticide uses. But we're also aware that a better diet for people is a health-enhancing situation, and pesticides are one of the most dramatic ways we have made food so much more plentiful and so much more available throughout the world. We're talking about the risk of pesticide and the risk of higher priced food.
They do exist.
They do
No,
exist.
they don't exist. The question is, which pesticide do you use?
No, it's
The
not.
question
But
is,
isn't there-
look
isn't
what
there-
happened to-
Pesticides are being attacked by the
But
environmental
Fred,
community.
Look
They're
what
not
happened
trivial.
to the apple industry after Alar
That's
was
right.
released.
Apples
Wait a
became
minute.
somewhat
What
less
happened?
fresh, somewhat less available, and the apple industry
happened?
absorbed large losses. That's
No,
what happened.
sir, that is not
That
what
is
happened.
exactly what
No,
happened
that
in the
isn't what
situation,
happened.
and it's happening over and over again. We have now got
Fred,
a $150 billion.
stop for a second.
$150 billion we're spending on regulation. That is not invisible.
Apples are
that
not more
costs more
expensive.
in our food system.
Apples are not more expensive.
is-
Apple industry profits have doubled.
Lester, you were an economist.
I
Tell us
love to hear
Tell us
people
about
talk about economics. You may one day want to get my stock market predictions. So we'll treat the way that some. I think that I don't hear anybody here saying that we shouldn't have pesticides. I mean, if I'm wrong about that, let somebody come forward. I think that everybody here would say that the unintelligent use of pesticides, which many farmers have done in the past, that is, applying far too much of them when it's not needed, everybody here would condemn that. So we're now all in the middle ground of asking, what is it that people should do? Does a farmer who is not educated in this stuff, should that person have the sole ability to make the choices? When there are spillover effects because of food, because of what goes onto somebody else's property, I think the answer is clearly no about that. Now, can we be so restrictive in these regulations that we drive up the price of food and we hurt people? Absolutely we can. Have there been EPA decisions like that? I believe there have, although I can't name one for you right now. Now, let's talk about, Fred had this earlier, what are the kinds of institutions that we need? How do we get to make these decisions in real time instead of hanging them up for years? How do we get new classes of pesticides which are more benign in to replace the bad ones of the past?
Let's say I am a typical American consumer and parent. I'm Charlie Consumer. I'm getting my sources of information from industry groups, I'm getting them from environmental groups, and I'm getting them through the media. Who am I supposed to believe?
I think that exactly the problem is that all of the institutions that you're talking about have at some time in the past lied to the public.
Absolutely.
Whether you're talking about the
government, media, environmentalists, and industry, they've all
Absolutely.
lied to the public at some point.
And the large problem that we have in our society now is that there is a lack of trust for experts and institutions. All of the public understands that no matter who it is who says something, that you have to believe that that may not be true. Now, we have a number of institutions that are catching up and are actually trying to do something now. I think of, for example, the chemical industry's CARE program, which is trying very hard to win the trust of the public. Certainly, some of the environmental groups are fitting exactly that. Our problem as a society is precisely that we told lies in the past, and now we have to generate the truth of the trust of the public again if we're going to get beyond this nonsense we're in right now, where the public doesn't believe anybody on anything.
But there's something else to it, which is that scientists, because they work on a frontier between what's known and what's unknown, are very comfortable with uncertainty. They have ways to measure it. It's a thing for them that is a sort of a positive. Because if you don't have uncertainty, you're not doing real science, you're not on the frontier. And so they think in terms of uncertainty, they measure it, they're comfortable with it. The whole rest of society operates by trying to stamp out uncertainty, right? Our legal system. A jury can't come in and say, we think this defendant has an 80% probability of being guilty, right? It's yes or no. So all the rest of us are trained to think black, white, yes, no. And scientists alone have a completely different approach to uncertainty. And it doesn't translate in the media at all.
Okay,
right?
we are running out of time. What I would like to do is go around the room, starting with Fred, with a brief response, please, to a question we like to ask here, which is, given this discussion, what do you all agree upon and disagree upon?
I think the main thing we agree upon is that the current way we're managing risk in our society has many flaws, and that we desperately need to look at risk in a more intelligent way and reach some way of allowing America to proceed into the future without frightening itself to death. How we do that is not clear, and we certainly have no consensus to date.
I think I agree very much with what Jessica said. I think we need to, in our communicating with the public, to spell out what we know and what we don't know, and the assumptions that we use in the face of that uncertainty. I think, coming from a school of public health, that we should be protective and preventive in our approach. But we are faced with a situation of catch-up and dealing with chemicals that are already out there. And for the future, I think I sense an agreement that pollution prevention is a very good thing.
Lester?
We've made an enormous amount of progress. Frankly, much more agreement here than I thought before the show. I think we agree that there are some problems out there in the environment. I think that we agree that getting rid of all chemicals, all pesticides is something that we're not even willing to think about seriously. We have to think about how we manage these. Precisely the way that we do that, whether it's through an environmental protection agency and something else, we don't have agreement here. But I think that the boogeyman of saying that chemicals are terrible or chemicals are the best thing that ever happened to you, we've dispelled.
I would agree with, I think, everything that's been said. I think Lester has made the point several times, and it needs to be emphasized, that there is not a very good match between what we understand to be the biggest risks and what the public perceives to be the biggest risks. It'll never be perfect, and it never should be, but it could certainly be better.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica Matthews, Frederica Perera, Lester Lave, and Fred Smith. And thank you. We enjoy hearing from our audience. Please send your comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. And we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.